Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass.
Hello and welcome to Shining Moon episode 34, Writing Media Tie-Ins. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. With me today are Marie Brennan, Kate Heartfield, and Caitlin J. Starling. Let's get started with some introductions. Marie Brennan is a former anthropologist and folklorist who shamelessly leans into her academic fields for inspiration. In addition to her tie-in work for Legend of the Five Rings, she is the author of more than 20 novels, more than 80 short stories, and a grand total of 3 poems. We're going to work on that with you. We're going to make sure that we're going to bump those numbers up. All right. With as half of M.A. Carrick, she is also the author of the Rook and Rose epic fantasy trilogy. Hello, Marie. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for being with us again.
I'm glad to be here again and that you're still not tired of me.
Never. You have too many good things to say. Kate Heartfield's latest novel, The Valkyrie, is a retelling of old legends. Her novel, The Embroidered Book, was a Sunday Times bestseller. Kate has written 2 Assassin's Creed novels, The Magus Conspiracy and The Resurrection Plot. Her novels, novellas, and short stories and games have won or been shortlisted for several major awards, including the Nebula, Aurora, and World Fantasy Awards. She is a former journalist who lives near Ottawa, Canada. Welcome back to the podcast, Kate.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
Oh, it's a delight to be able to talk with you again. Caitlin Starling is the best-selling author of The Death of Jane Lawrence, Last to Leave the Room, and the Bram Stoker-nominated The Luminous Dead. Her other works include Yellow Jessamine and a Vampire the Masquerade novella, The Land of Milk and Honey, published in the collection Walk Among Us. Her nonfiction has appeared in Nightmare, Uncanny, and Tor, Nightfire. Caitlin also works in narrative design and has been paid to invent body parts. And I am going to ask you about that.
Oh, I want to know about it
loves
too.
To ask about that one.
It
involves Kim Kardashian.
Okay. With a hint like that, I have to say, tell us more.
Only that it was a weird immersive theatrical production that was run by a PR guy, a guy who runs a PR firm usually. And so he's like just casually friends with like Tan France from Queer Eye. And so like he just roped them into doing Instagram spots to build buzz for the project before it launched. So we got to do special effects makeup on them and everything. And yeah, Kim Kardashian had this like LED implanted necklace looking thing, and everyone on Instagram hated it and was just disgusted and actually thought she'd really gotten something implanted, which is fun. My job was, along with like designing a bunch of the stuff, and doing all the world building, was also to make sure that we didn't tip too far into horror, which is a little bit difficult when you're doing radical body modifications sold in presented in a sales floor like environment.
Yeah.
I was like, so do you want to do Repo the Genetic Opera? And he went, what's that? And I'm like, okay, we need to do some background discussions.
I love this. This is wonderful. Okay, I'm going to start by saying that I obviously have a cold this week, so if anybody is noticing that my voice is just that little bit more into the vibrato range than it normally is, that is why. And I will probably be having to put myself on mute periodically, so I apologize up front if I do not go, yes, that's wonderful, every time you say something that is great, because you will be saying things that are great, and I want to be able to respond to that. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about my experience working with other people's IP. I have in my background that I wrote a 1,000,000-word fanfic of Mass Effect between 2010 and 2012, which got me a lot of attention. It got me about 25,000 emails, which is a lot of emails. Some of those are the automated ones saying people have liked your story, people have subscribed to your story, but a lot of them were fan emails that said, hey, we have questions. You need to answer that in the next chapter. And I said, okay, I will do so. So it was a very interesting experience for me. So I know how to integrate with an established universe. I know how to go into their background details and weave things seamlessly into what they have already established. Then a few years ago, the Black Library got in touch with me to ask me if I'd pitch them some Warhammer stories. Now, I have no experience with Warhammer whatsoever, so they sent me basically their beginner's Bible, and I drowned. I absolutely drowned because Warhammer is a really big hole to fall into. And so I asked a friend who is a 40K fan for help, and then I drowned some more. And then I eventually came up with about 5 or 6 pitches for short stories, all of which were subsequently declined, and I was really bummed about that. So I have just enough information at my disposal to ask you guys good questions. So I'm going to start with, were you invited to contribute, or did you find a call and respond to it? And we're going to start with Caitlin, because she's at the top of my screen. For your Vampire the Masquerade thing, did they invite you to do this? Did you find a call? How did this start?
So I was invited. I was not invited by the IP holders directly, though. So they, for the Walk Among Us collection, hired Harper Voyager to organize and produce it. And Harper Voyager had just published The Luminous Dead. And so my editor from that, David Pomerico, came and was like, hey, do you want to pitch? They didn't, of course, tell me what it was at first, but he's like, okay, it's IP, it's novella length, it's about vampires. Do you want to sign an NDA? So I signed the NDA, saw it was Vampire the Masquerade, promptly lost my shit because as a young, weird goth teenager, I had never played because I didn't have enough friends to play, but I did read everything.
Been there.
And suddenly I was being asked to come up with some cool stuff. I did find out later I was apparently like a pinch hitter. So there are three total stories in the collection, one by Cassandra Call, one by Genevieve Gornichek, and one by myself. And
Big names.
Cass and Genevieve were asked several months before I was. So my only guess is that they had a third person who had to drop out or ended up not being as good of a fit as they'd hoped. And then David Pomerico went, I know someone who can write fast, and grabbed me.
Interesting. I'm going to move down to Marie, and I'm going to ask you the same question. Were you on your Legend of the Five Rings thing? Were you invited, or how did this work?
Yes, kind of the answer is yes. Both invited and approached them at different stages. I'll try to keep this brief, but my involvement with L5R has been a very multi-stage thing. It started out with when the game was owned by AEG. They held what they referred to as a contest. For me, looking at it as a writer, I'm like, this was an open submissions call. It was invitations to submit proposals for chapters in an upcoming RPG book. And I sent in 2 proposals. They accepted one of them, so I got to write that chapter. And then I just kind of got looped into future emails about other books that they were going to write for the RPG, where they would send the outline and say, okay, call dibs on what you want to write. Toward the end of my time doing that, I did get approached to see if I wanted to join the story team, who were the people that wrote the short stories, because L5R has usually had a sort of ongoing meta plot canon storyline that gets advanced through these short stories. I declined to do that because I found out that it turns out AEG paid its freelance story writers in cards for the card game. Which is not actually pay. So I declined to do that. Shortly after that, the game got sold to Fantasy Flight instead. I happened to be at Gen Con the year that took place, and so I actually went to the Fantasy Flight booth and basically wandered around pestering people there until I got an email address for somebody involved with L5R. And then I just cold emailed them out of the blue going, hey, I don't know if you're planning on rebooting or doing something with that short story line like they used to do, but if you are, call me. And that worked. I actually did get contacted, and so for a chunk of time, I probably wrote more than a dozen short stories for the reboot of that canon storyline. Fantasy Flight did pay actual money. And then they said they wanted to do a line of novellas for the different great clans that make up the setting, so I pitched them a Dragon Clan novella, and they accepted that, so I wrote The Eternal Knot. And then when Aconite Books paired with Fantasy Flight to start doing novels in the L5R setting, I got approached by an Aconite editor to say, hey, we would like you to write a novel for the setting if you're interested. And as a side thing, because Caitlin mentioned NDAs, I can't give specifics on this, but there is a separate IP that I have written something for, which will be out someday. One of the things that can happen with media tie-in stuff is your stuff goes into a void, and maybe it comes out someday, or maybe it doesn't. Like sometimes for tie-ins, you will write things that then never get published. You get paid though, so that's good. And that was one where I got approached by somebody who was just a fan of my work and happened to be involved with this project and came to me and said, "Will you write a thing for Redacted?" So yes, like it can be both the you approach them and they approach you. It just depends on the specific circumstances.
I know that feeling very well because I approached a publisher of a gaming type, and they said to talk with them further, I would have to sign an NDA. So I actually can't talk about it.
Exactly. That's what makes it hard to do this.
It's sitting in a slush pile. I haven't heard back from them since October. I have queried them. I'm like, guys, am I still under consideration? It's a black hole now.
I've been asked to submit pitches for a couple other things that I didn't get picked for, but I'll never be able to talk about either because
yeah.
The fun thing is when my agent is very firm about not letting this happen, but technically they can try and lock up the idea that you pitch them, so you can't use it in a stripped out version for something else.
Yeah. That was one of the things I asked Black Library about. I'm like, is my idea still mine? They said, oh yes, your idea is still yours. I'm like, and I still haven't figured out how to strip all the stuff out because some of the stuff was just so tightly
very
wound
specific,
into with their stuff. So
Yeah, that other thing I've written,
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, just the other thing that I've written that I'm waiting to be able to talk about. It's definitely something where, I would not be able to sort of file off serial numbers. It's too intertwined with the setting.
Yeah, exactly. Kate, were you invited to contribute, or did you find a call and respond to it with respect to the Assassin's Creed stuff?
Yeah, I did pitch, but I didn't exactly pitch cold out of nowhere. So somewhere in the middle. So I heard through my agent that Aconite Books was looking for a writer to write. And I didn't know at that time that it was Assassin's Creed, but they were looking for someone to write something that I knew was historical and gaming related. And I said, well, I think I might know what that might be.
That Venn diagram might be me.
Yeah, exactly. So I did. I expressed my interest and I signed the NDA, and I discovered that Aconite was looking to write some books because in the Assassin's Creed universe in the 19th century, and these would be originals in the sense that they are in the Assassin's Creed universe, but they're not novelizations of any particular game.
Yeah.
So then we sort of started a conversation where I pitched a couple of ideas and they came back to me with some suggestions. And actually we merged the ideas to an extent that they liked some things from one and some things from the other. Yeah. And, then there was a process of just sort of refining the pitch and the outline. And then once they were happy, I got the green light from Ubisoft, which is the rights holder for Assassin's Creed, and went from there. So, so it was because I had an agent who was the connector. It wasn't like I just sort of wrote an email to Aconite out of the blue, but it was a process of pitching.
Interesting. I'm going to go back to Caitlin, and you talked a little bit about having had an interest in Vampire the Masquerade to begin with. Mm-hmm. How much previous experience in the universe did you have, and how did they wind up filling in the gaps for you?
So, like I said, I'd never actually gone to play any Vampire the Masquerade, but I had read the source books that were, I don't remember which edition, if it was 3rd or 4th edition, but whatever was current in like 2004 to 2008. I'd read the source books, I read the rule books, and I read some of the novel tie-ins that were released at that time. And I had read like the Book of Nod, which was a lore book that they published standalone. And I also watched the very special TV show, Kindred the Embraced. Which I very much enjoyed as like a 14-year-old.
Kindred the Embarrassed, my friends call it.
I don't think I liked it because it was good. I think I liked it because it was deliciously terrible. But so I was fairly familiar, but then I hadn't really thought about it again since. I had never played Bloodlines, and actually what the Walk Among Us tie-in was supposed to be for was at one point Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 was supposed to be released in 2020, 2021, around there.
Yeah.
but Paradox, who had bought the rights from White Wolf and everything else, had gotten the game back from whoever I can't remember the company that they had hired to build it, and went, "This is not publishable." And we have not heard, I don't think, since what's happening with them remaking the game. So the book was kind of quietly deprioritized. It still came out, but so Paradox gave me basically access to everything they had for 5th edition, because it had to be it was around when they launched 5e, and everything had to be consistent with the world building changes they had made for 5e. So they gave me access to everything, including the stuff that hadn't been published yet, on a lovely Google Drive. And they also gave me sort of like we think these are the areas you should pay attention to the most, but here's everything in case you want to fully immerse yourself. And so, yeah, I read through and kind of saw what had happened. Interestingly, for Vampire the Masquerade, because it is supposed to be set in our world, their additions, they do tweaks to the world building and stuff, but also it's just, okay, what's happened in the last decade and how is it integrated into the world building? So it was kind of like just catching up on their version of Wikipedia of what had changed since the early 2000s. It was nice. For other stuff, for the things I can't talk about in detail, I've been sent things like fancy PowerPoint slides that have basically like, these are the high points. And then I think if I had been brought on, I probably would have gotten deeper or a larger selection of things to read into. But the PowerPoint slide is a big favorite of we want you to pitch, here's some stuff to use.
I'm actually in the position where I am actually GMing a Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition thing going forward right now. So I'm a little bit more conversant than I would have been a few weeks ago with all of that. I am relying strongly on one player who is encyclopedic in his knowledge of the world setting. So I understand completely what you mean about the density of information that this IP has, and also the fact that so much of it is tied into our world. Mm-hmm. So that definitely tallies with my experience of it. So my kudos to you for being able to surf above it and being able to turn out a beautiful novella from it. Marie, with your Legend of the Five Rings, how much had you gotten into it before? Or were you going in cold?
No, I was not going in cold, which was good, because L5R has a really richly developed setting. That's actually one of the reasons I like the game, because I'm an anthropology nerd, and so you give me a really well-built secondary world based on, a historical region and time period that I find interesting, and it's my catnip. So a friend had invited me to play in an L5R game, and I basically read through pretty much all the books that had been published for the RPG up until that point. Now, what I hadn't done was gone and read all of the, at that point, like over a decade of fictions, like weekly fictions that had been published by the story team, because they were just churning them out for a while. So I wasn't up on all of that stuff, but I didn't really need to be for the things I was writing for the RPG. Actually, the chapter I pitched that got accepted for the RPG book was an AU version of the setting. So it's like, sweet, I get to go, what if this thing went differently? I now make things up. And then when I started writing the fiction, Fantasy Flight explicitly rebooted the story and said, we're going back to kind of the starting point. We're doing a different version of it here. So I didn't have to go and read, at that point, like 15 years worth of story team fictions.
That was one of my follow-up questions, was going to be, how did in terms of continuity, how much were you paying attention to other people's work?
So I did pay some attention to the other fictions that were being written in the rebooted storyline, but I did not go back and read everything that came before, which when I started doing the novels, one of the interviews I did, someone was asking me like, did you go read the old Clan War novels from, the AEG days? Did you consult with the people who originally wrote this stuff? And I'm like, no. I'm sorry, but we rebooted it. I don't have to go through all of that stuff. But I like the Assassin's Creed thing, that also crossed my radar around the same time that I think it did for Kate. And that's one that I looked at and went, I played like the first quarter of the first game and know like little bits of later games. And so I did not have any familiarity with the canon. And in that instance, I sort of looked at it and thought, I I don't think I have it in me to do the level of work I think I would need to do to familiarize myself with this in order to even pitch them something, because I was starting from such a dead halt.
Yeah.
That, yeah, it can make a big difference. It's certainly possible to write a good tie-in where you just get sent the packet of like, okay, here's your information, mainline this, and then go. And there are people
Yeah.
who do that very well. But I'll admit I prefer to be working in something that I already have familiarity with, so that I'm not, trying to go from 0 to 60.
My problem with the Warhammer stuff is that I am a problem solver and my characters tend to be too. So when I find something that is an inherent problem in the setting, my first impulse is to take what they have given me and solve the problem. You cannot do that in the grimdark future of 40K.
Yeah.
Because to have solved a problem means that it's no longer a problem, and therefore things will get better.
Yeah.
So.
And actually, we'll probably want to come back to that later, but the question of like, what can you change and what can't you change when writing in a setting? Like, we can look back to that later.
Yeah, we're going to go over to Kate, and we're going to ask about your experience with Assassin's Creed before you even got started. Had you played the games? Are you an Assassin's Creed nerd, basically?
Yeah, I was to a degree. I mean, I was quite familiar with the games. Not that I had played all of them, but I had played a few of them myself. And more importantly, I had watched my kid and my partner play several more. So between having just had it on the screen while I was walking through a room or doing the dishes or whatever, for several of the games meant that I was really familiar with various settings and various games. And since I had played it myself, I've played Syndicate all the way through, like almost total completion. And I think at that time I had maybe played a little bit of Assassin's Creed 2 or Unity or something as well. So I had like enough of a background that I understood the world anyway.
Yeah.
A lot more than I did.
It's an enormous help. It's an enormous help.
Yeah.
Because if you're just going in cold, it is really, really uncomfortable. I say that having played the Mass Effects and having basically devoured them and able to create a huge fanfic out of that. And then the experience of trying to pitch to Black Library where I didn't know what I was doing, it's a very different experience. And trying
definitely.
to coordinate what you know and what they want. It's hard.
Yeah, and
so I'm going to go back.
Yeah, no, sorry. I'm just going to say too, and I think that with Assassin's Creed in particular too, I think having been familiar with it was really helpful, but also because it's another one like Vampire the Masquerade that's set in our world, and while that did present challenges I could talk about, but it also is helpful because it's not all totally invented. So the lore of Assassin's Creed is, it's not itself super rich because it's built right into history. So as a history nerd, I felt comfortable because of that.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, you already have the tools at your disposal because you and I are both history nerds, and it's easy to find out more because the world is already there.
Yeah.
And it's just a question of knowing how to research, and we both know how to do that. And yeah, it makes total sense. I'm going to bot back up to Caitlin, and I'm going to ask, how would you describe the process of writing that media tie-in for you from start to finish? Did they provide you with a loose outline of what they wanted, or did you come up with your own pitch and write to your own outline? So you've answered that in part already, but I'd love more detail.
I actually wrote 3 pitches for them. Because specifically, they already had Cass Kaw and Genevieve Gordichek's stories. So they were looking to see, okay, well, we need one more story. We know what we're getting the other 2. What haven't we done? Like what have we done that we don't want to repeat? And so I had one, and it's really interesting, actually, speaking of the being able to reuse ideas. One of them was an idea that had to do with basically trying to hide out in a newly turned vampire trying to hide out in a cabin, which then became semi-related to another pitch for a different IP that I did that had no vampires, but the setting was about the same, which then the 2 of those kind of combined into something that I eventually pitched as an original thing to my publisher, and is potentially going to be a book in 2026. They still haven't decided on it, but so it's you can take them apart and reuse them. Sometimes when you get lucky. So that was one pitch. Another pitch was a gothic horror type pitch that actually then became a short story that's going to be in a collection called The Crawling Moon, which is coming out from Neon Hemlock, hopefully in a couple months, which is
nice.
Queer gothic horror desire stuff.
I love Neon Hemlock. They put out such really interesting things.
They are fantastic. I love working with them. And then the third pitch, they both were like, well, those two are really fun, but they don't fit with what we need. Can you come up with a third one? And the third one that I came up with is the one that ended up being turned into, I built it out into the novella, which is about arts and farming commune in Portland that's a quote unquote ethical blood farm. And it was interesting. So basically let me do within once they had found a story type that they liked, they double check. They had me outline it so they could double check what lore I would need to comply with, but otherwise I had total freedom. All three of us did that. They wanted stories from us in their world instead of they wanted stories in their world that happened to be written by us. So like Cascaw got to write about torturing a tech bro who decided, oh yeah, I'm gonna become a vampire, cool, and then he ends up being tortured in Iceland for a very long time. And Genevieve wrote like a falling in with the wrong crowd while super depressed in college story. And then I've got mine. It was really interesting. So yeah, I mostly interacted with the editor at Harper Voyager, but every so often he would send stuff to Paradox and they would weigh in. But one time we had a call, except they were all in Sweden, so I had to do it at like 1 a.m. my time,
God.
which that did suck. But they were really helpful. They would get really excited basically when I would be like, so I was thinking about doing XYZ and like I kind of grabbed this bit of lore, and they would just be like, oh yeah, and have you looked at this part? And we need to send you this part that isn't, it's like not even through edits yet on our side, but you need to read it. And it was really fun. It was very much like we kind of danced around. It was like writing fan fiction in the sense that they wanted to see how I would transform their stuff. And because they had just started 5e, I was setting canon for Portland. The decisions I made, they were like, yeah, we will abide by them, and anything else we do that's set in the Pacific Northwest, your stuff is now canon, which was like, ooh, the power.
Yeah.
I love this. Okay, and Marie was definitely nodding along for some of that. So how would you describe the process of writing your media tie-in start to finish? Give me the details.
So it depends on which piece I was writing, because with the short stories, one of the other freelancers at one point, I think very aptly, compared it to Iron Chef. It was a little bit of, they would say, okay, we need a story, like this is one that I wrote, we need something where Kitsuki Chiari needs to find this piece of evidence that will somehow make her conclude that the Emperor was murdered and did not die of natural causes. Go! I'm like, okay, it's up to me to figure out how she gets into a place she should not be and happens to notice this like tiny spatter of blood on this sacred weapon here. Like, I gotta figure out how to make that go. So the short fictions were much more like Iron Chef. I was given, sometimes much vaguer ones. It's like, okay, so we've got these two characters who are leading this army over to the capital. We should do something with them? Story? And I'm like, okay, I gotta figure out something interesting to have happen along the way that isn't them getting into a battle that would, mean that they don't get to the capital.
Over here.
Yeah. So it was sometimes very specific, sometimes very vague, but it was very Iron Chef-y they would give us like what needs to happen, but it's up to you to figure out everything around that.
Here are your ingredients, go.
Pretty much. The novels were much more like what Caitlin was describing. I actually had a conversation with the editor very early on about like, okay, the other authors that you're talking to, like, what have they pitched to you? What are the kinds of things that are already in the pipeline? And let me find the corners that aren't being explored yet, within the bounds of what was I interested in writing. And that is fun because, again, yeah, you get to set canon sometimes. And even in the short fictions where there were things that, I was given that were my essential ingredients, I was still going to them and saying, hey, can I say that this is true in the world? And they would go and check and say, yeah. I think that in general, the comparison I've made before is I think that writing tie-in fiction is very similar to writing historical fiction. because there is an existing world, an existing history and framework that you're figuring out where to position your story in. Now, it does come with restrictions that historical fiction doesn't have. Like, you don't have the freedom to say, okay, you want a piece of Victorian historical fiction. What if Queen Victoria was actually a Lovecraftian tentacle monster? They'd be like, no, we're not doing that. And you may not be able to do things like take those Warhammer 40k things and go, oh, but I know of a way this problem could go away. And they're like, that problem is one of the engines that drives this setting. Do not rip it out.
Yes, exactly.
And so it does suck a little bit, I will say, if you're more on the discovery writer end of the spectrum. AP tie-in stuff, they will frequently want a more or less detailed outline. It depends on the circumstances. But I did have to send in an outline of my books before I wrote them so that they could do exactly what Caitlin described of say, okay, here's the places where it's intersecting with specific canon stuff. We need to, check that and make sure this isn't in contradiction of anything.
Yeah.
And then I would write the book and send it to my editor. She sent me her editorial notes, revise it per usual. And then it would go through the canon review stage and come back to me with like, yeah, this bit, like, this is a little more like R-rated than PG-13. Please tone this down. This bit here doesn't work with this detail that we've established, whatever. So yeah, it's got more layers of approval that it has to go through, but it's still the same gear in my head of going, okay, I must familiarize myself with the setting and the events and the people if there are canon people showing up, and then figure out my story within that.
Yeah, it might be obvious, but important to note. So when I turn in an outline to my normal publisher and I go off the outline, they're usually fine with that.
Right.
Less fine. You do have to send, if you realize like in the process of writing that your current outline does not work, you do need to run the new outline, usually past IP, so that they're fine with where it ends up.
I definitely understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little, I think the degree of flexibility varies depending on the IP. I'm told that, like, if you're working with Marvel, do not expect to have room to so much as twitch an eyelash without permission.
Yeah, I have and Star Wars too.
Yeah, whereas, like, L5R, I think in my outline I was like, and this character goes off on a journey into a spirit realm while this one stays behind, and then when I wrote the book, I'm like, no, they're going to swap places, and nobody cared. That's fine.
But you just have to check it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kate, how would you describe your process? Talk to me about the details of whether they provided you what details they provided you. Was it Iron Chefy? Was it more on you? How did this work?
Yeah. So I was nodding along because it's a lot of what Caitlin and Marie have been saying is very similar to my experience. So because Assassin's Creed is set in real world history, that was a lot of the brainstorming process you had to do with history. So we started out wanting to have something in the 19th century and it connected to the spate of political assassinations and assassination attempts in the 19th century in Europe in the middle of the century. And so the outlines that I knew that it was possible that there be more than one book, but we were working just with one book to begin with. And eventually I ended up writing 2 books in a series, like a duology. So the outline was, they do want a sort of almost a beat by beat or chapter by chapter outline of what's going to happen. And I am the kind of writer who writes an outline and then it changes as I go, inevitably.
Yes.
And I
am that way.
For my own work, as Caitlin was saying, if it needs to diverge, as long as it works, they don't care, really. But with IP work, you do have to be a little more careful. And we did run into a bit of an issue with the second one I wrote, is in that there were pieces of the outline that just I was not going to be able to cram into this 80,000 word book. Like, I got there and I was like, I don't know what I was thinking. I cannot have this whole side plot happen, and eventually I did it. When I sent it to my editor, she was like, I remember something about ships that was like, nope, that's not in there anymore. Sorry. So, and she was like, okay. So there was, it was a little bit more of like, trying to stick to the outline more and communicate with my editor when I went off it with, which was unusual compared to the kind of work that I'm used to doing with novels, for sure.
Yeah, and I would add into that because, Kate, you mentioning dropping the bit with the ships. In my experience, tie-in work much more than original stuff, you will actually have one structure we haven't brought up, which is length. Like, the
Mhm.
short
Yeah.
stories I was writing, they needed to be 3,000 words, like, give or take maybe
Ooh.
1 or 200. It was not, 3 to 6,000 kind of thing. The
Mhm.
novels, it was, okay, 80 to 86,000 words. Like, here's your window, hit it. So, yeah, you gotta be
Wow.
able to figure out how much story is gonna fit in the size sack they have given you.
Yeah.
That's,
Mhm.
I think some cases you'll probably have a little more flexibility, but it can be pretty strict.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
strict in the like there's several ways in which it's more strict, like there's the length is more strict and the outline is more strict and the time is maybe not more strict but certainly more constrained.
Oh
I
yeah,
would say.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
if anybody listening to this is thinking about doing tie-in writing, above all else, I think what the people who own these IPs and are recruiting writers for it want is people who are reliable.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've got to deliver by your deadline. Even better if you're fast, so that the deadline can be soon.
Yeah.
But you've got to be somebody that they can rely on to turn in a compliant thing at the time, like at the length desired and at the time specified.
Yeah.
There's no leeway for that. Oh, I need another 6 months.
6
No.
months, that would be nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine was a novella, and they gave me some freedom within the range. I think Cass's is probably maybe the shortest in the book, and mine might be the longest. But I was recruited to do it in October, maybe late September, and I had to turn in a final draft, aside from like copy edits and stuff like that, by mid-January.
Oh, okay, that's super tight. Yeah, fast and reliable.
I turned in a draft to my editor, and he came back and he's like, "Okay, I really like it, but I think you need to make it present tense instead of past tense, and I want you to."
Oh
And
my God.
this is why and we'll talk about this more probably when we do our readings. But he's like, "I want you to be more coy about the fact that it's about vampires." And I went, "But it's IP for Vampire the Masquerade. It's
Masquerade.
on the tin."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Yeah, I don't care. Do it." I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah.
It ended up being a fairly fast rewrite. And it helps that even though it's a longer novella, it's like first person, fairly colloquial, and in the style of a farming memoir. So it's just really chill in a lot of ways.
I hate doing tense changes because I will
Yeah.
invariably miss verbs.
Oh,
like
yeah.
it's
Yes.
the
Oh,
amount
yes.
of fine scrubbing I have to do to make sure that I have changed all of the verbs to the correct tense is large.
Yes, absolutely. There's always going to be one that you miss, which is why you have the copy editor come in
Yeah.
after you with the dustpan and broom after you.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
still, it's still a lot of work.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to start with Kate on this question. What do you like about playing in somebody else's universe? What's fun about it?
A couple of things come to mind, and one of them kind of perhaps counterintuitively is the stuff that we've just been talking about, which is the constraints. Is that it's kind of rewarding as a writer to challenge yourself in that regard and say, okay, well,
Yes.
can I do this? Can I write to these constraints? And constraints, I think, often can trigger creativity in interesting ways. So you have a new set of rules to work in that can make you more creative as a writer, or creative in different ways, I think, that you haven't explored before. So that I found really rewarding. And the other thing that I find really rewarding about it is the feeling of collaborating with a bunch of people, like people that you have never met and never will meet for the most part. But and as you were talking about at the beginning, Deborah, talking about fan fiction, and that's an experience I haven't had. I've never written fan fiction, but I know that, I gather that's a big element of the appeal, is the idea of there's a sense of writing in community, and I think
Yes.
that's what appealed to me about writing for Assassin's Creed as well.
I will say that what you said about constraints is exactly how I feel about form poetry. Is while free verse is wonderful, and I would not leave it out of my toolbox, having the constraints of form is now my co-pilot. And I might not wind up writing the thing that I thought I was going to write, but sometimes I wind up someplace better.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Marie, what is fun about playing in somebody else's universe?
So there's a couple of things. I agree with what Kate said about that feeling of writing in community. And because I was working on an IP, not the NDA one, but, the L5R stuff, where I was already a fan. And so the ability to get to contribute stuff, and this was especially true with the short fictions, that there were things in the development of the reboot where I would say, like, well, what if this? Like, can we say this is true? And they would say yes. I'm like, cool, this thing that I like, I've now put a little brick into the wall. Okay, I have to do a little anecdote because my husband will never forgive me if I don't. This is for the gamers out there. While I was writing for the RPG books in 4th edition, there came a point where I'd had a disagreement with my GM over whether a particular skill could be used in a particular way. And then a pitch goes out, they're like, okay, here's the outline for, this next book. And I wrote to them, I was like, can we put in a sidebar about this particular use of a skill? And they were like, cool, yeah, write that sidebar. And so this is how I won an argument with my GM, by writing it into a published book that you can use that skill that way.
I love that.
Yeah. But the thing with the novels, this is going to be funny because I know Kate had the exact opposite experience of this. This is as close to easy mode as novel writing has ever been for me, because it's a setting that already exists in a great deal of richness, and I know it very, very well. And so while there are things that I'm adding into it, because the L5R setting is heavily based on historical Japan, and so there's things that I know from researching Japan that I would say, hey, can I bring this in and make it part of the setting because it will help my plot? The world already exists for me in large part, and I don't even have to go do massive amounts of reading to research it. I just know it. And so I still have to think about the characters and the plot and the prose and all those aspects of it. But it was like there was this one bit that was already, the progress bar said 90% complete, rather than me having to do that at the same time. And so it's, these books were very pleasant and easy to write. It also helped that, they're 80 to 86,000 words. And I was writing this trilogy at the same time that I was doing the Rook and Rose books with Alyss, which are over 200,000 words long. And so, an 80,000 word book in a setting I already know, that's like vacation.
Yeah. All right. Caitlin, how about you? What do you like about playing in somebody else's pool?
A lot of what we've already talked about. I love the constraints. I also used to write a lot. I used to write a lot of fan fiction. I still did until I had my kid, and now I don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
But I cut my teeth on fan fiction and written text role play. So getting to write, the thing about text role play is you're writing for a very specific person that
yes.
I'm going to set you off with this next post, and it's fantastic. But I feel like it taught me a lot about writing to get a response from the reader, writing to engage the reader.
100% agree.
And so that I got to do that with Vampire the Masquerade, which was really cool because I was familiar with it. It was also very terrifying because I was sitting there going, well, what if players end up not liking my interpretation? What if players who have games set in Portland don't like what I just did to canon? Mostly I just tried to ignore that. It turns out people seem to have liked what I did, which is cool. But I also liked that I had never written a contemporary setting thing. This made me stretch. And it seems weird to say that a contemporary thing is stretching, but it was. It is not a type of story that I'm used to telling, that I'm not familiar with how to really make it that engaging. And it really made me kind of look at what my own life and interests and stuff could add to this book that I was writing, which is why it's about sheep and cooking and it's just a lot of random stuff. But it was a fun challenge, and it was once we got it locked in, a very defined challenge and sort of a puzzle of how do I pull this off. And as terrifying as the very short time frame I had to write it in, it was over and done really fast. It was, just one intense couple months, and then suddenly there's a thing in the world.
Caitlin, what you said about the writing for the fan response, the L5R canon storyline ended up being sort of wrapped up sort of early. Basically, Fantasy Flight decided they weren't going to continue with that. And there was a thing that in the early development of the game, I had said, okay, what if we take this thing that was in this way in the original canon, and we change it to be this other thing in the new canon? Because I don't think that, the players are going to suspect that. I think this is going to take them by surprise in a good way. And so when we're wrapping up the storyline, I basically went to the story team, the people in charge of all this. I was like, please. I didn't even get paid for it. I'm like, I have written a little piece of flash fiction that reveals that thing. Please, God, can we put it out in the world? Because I will die if I don't get to see players' heads explode. I have to have this come out, and they worked it into the finale of the storyline. But yeah, I'm like,
Nice.
I have been waiting for the day we get to reveal this to see how people react to it.
Yeah.
Don't deprive me
That
of
is a huge part of it, the community, and that was something I was going to ask: is what kind of reception have you gotten for your tie-in work? Because obviously, in fan fiction, you get immediate response because it's a very one-to-one relationship with your readers, and when in normal fiction, it's a black hole. If you hear something back from a reader, it's because they sought you out on social media and said, "Hey, I read your thing," and it's like, "Holy shit, somebody read my thing!" And do you have more of a fan response from your tie-in work, or do you not? Is the black hole still?
It's even more of a black hole. I very rarely hear anything about this book. Part of that is because of how it released during the pandemic. It released audio only first for like the first year, but you still had to pay audiobook prices for it. Like they were trying to capture the podcast market, and that didn't work because podcasts don't cost $26. And then of course the Bloodlines 2 got pushed off, so all the marketing that was going to go with it went away. But when I do come across people talking about it and they do like what I wrote in it, it does feel special in a different way because it's not my usual audience. And it's and I have seen people say, "Wow, I really liked Caitlin Starling's piece in this. I'm going to go check out her other stuff now and see if it, it looks like it's completely different, but I still want to read it." Yes.
Yeah.
But other than that, no, I have no idea. I have no idea how it's generally perceived in the fandom. Just curtain.
Black hole. Yeah. Marie, same thing or different?
Variable. I got more feedback on the short stories because those were being published as like a serialized thing, basically. And so whenever a new story dropped, the L5R Discord, which I'm on, there would be people talking about the newest story. And especially at the very beginning, when the storyline got rebooted, there was a lot of very enthusiastic commentary. The novels less so. It's more on par with just publishing a novel in general. I don't see a lot of discussion of them. But with those, I do occasionally see things where people will be like, "Oh, this question about how do I handle this in my game has come up," and somebody will say, well, in one of Marie's books, here's how it's done. So here's your canon answer. So I do get to see that kind of thing a little bit. But yeah, it's not guaranteed. I think it depends heavily on which IP you're writing for. How much will you get the rabid fan response for good and for ill?
For good and for ill, yes. There was definitely some ill that I got. So, yeah. Kate, how about you? Is it a black hole for you as well, or because this is a video game, do you get more response?
I don't know if I've had more response, but definitely different, and it's been really actually that part of it has been one of the parts that just has been 100% lovely. It's been fantastic interacting with the fans. Yeah, it's nice. And I was worried, to be honest, when I started that, if I get something wrong, if you get something wrong in a historical fantasy novel, I will get emails. Sometimes they're nasty emails, but it's fine. But I was really worried about getting something wrong in something that meant so much to people and that people were fans of in this way. It just felt like a big responsibility. And so far, fingers crossed, I haven't gotten anything terribly wrong. And, people have been really, really welcoming and enthusiastic about the book, and not huge numbers, but I'd say there are about a dozen really active fans and fan writers who have just really engaged and invited me onto their podcasts, and they've written long pieces on the internet about the books, and the fan wiki is fantastic. The fan wiki now includes long pieces about my books, and it integrates it into the rest of it, and so that's something that I did not have that experience of a fandom before because, I'm not a big enough writer of my own novels to really I have readers, but I don't have a fandom. Right. And so that was a different experience. And that's been really cool. And the other thing I'll say about it is that I've had a few people, especially younger readers, contact me to say that one of my books for the Assassin's Creed books, got them into reading again. And that I found just really touching, that was something that doesn't, because normally nobody's going to pick up my big fat historical fantasy novel as something to get them back into reading. So this was a different audience, and I really love that.
That's a wonderful validation. That's incredible. I'm so pleased for you that you got that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, they're great people. So shout out to all the Assassin's Creed people.
Yay! All right, we're going to shift gears here a little bit, and we're going to do some readings. Normally, we only do one reading per Shining Moon. We're going to do 3 this time, and we're going to talk a little bit about each piece and how you wound up integrating into the world and what challenges you faced with it. We're going to start with Caitlin.
So I was torn on what to pick because I like reading from the beginning of this one. But as I mentioned earlier, I was told to be coy about not just the vampirism, but the fact that it's Vampire the Masquerade, which I still have opinions on. But so instead, I picked sort of the moment after the full-on reveal hits the reader. So,
Okay.
and this is probably where the biggest lore dump happens in the book, and I'm still not sure if I like how I did it. So I'll be interested to hear what you guys say. So for background, our narrator is the manager for a arts and farming commune that provides housing, basically free housing for anyone who's accepted. They allegedly accept people on a lottery model. There's a bit more management that goes into it than that.
I'm sure it has something to do with resonance. But
yeah,
anyways.
So she has just encountered a young man who came looking for housing and is what the Vampire the Masquerade world calls God, is it Duskborn or Duskblood? It's been a while now, but he's a really weakly blooded vampire. He can go out in the sun. He doesn't have strong clan ties. This is something that the Camarilla establishment generally doesn't like. And she was going, this why is this guy here? Like, can't he tell? Like, is he moving in on my territory? And when she finally flashed her fangs, which also flashes them to the reader for the first time, he freaks out and is like, oh God, I fucked up, help. But instead she offers him a job, or at least a job interview. So this is his job interview. I half expect Kasim to ghost us, but he's outside my office when I stroll into work on Tuesday, clutching a ragged satchel to his chest. He's dressed up a little for the occasion, and he's nervous. I take my time unlocking the door, checking my messages, straightening some paperwork before finally addressing him. Welcome back, I say. Follow me. An interview like this poses a few logistical problems that I'll admit I wasn't entirely prepared for. I don't want to take him to my house or to Lucille's because I don't need him knowing where we sleep if this doesn't work out, but I can't have him near the humans if we're going to talk shop. I considered the husk of Hawthorne House, but Robin's not allowed to work nights yet, and even if she could, I don't want him knowing where she sleeps either. That leaves somewhere off campus, the fields, or the barn. I pick the barn and shoot off 2 texts. One to Lucille telling her where we'll be, and one to Key telling them I've stepped out for my appointment, and can they please hold down the fort for the next 2 hours? It's still early, so there's a chance some community members will be working in the barn, but it's blessedly empty. Even the sheep are still mostly outside, only a few sick ones are penned in. I check the doors to be sure, then gesture with a lift of my chin to a hay bale. He sits. I extend my hand, and he gives me his papers, meaningless to anybody who doesn't know exactly what she's looking for. I do, though. He's exactly what his tattoo claims, a Duskborn who follows Camarilla law. I didn't know we had any Duskborn, but then again, it's not like they're allowed into Elysium meetings, and it's not like I go to Elysium meetings unless it's specifically demanded of me, so clearly I'm no expert. I ask him a few questions about his background and his hobbies while we wait for Lucille. After a nervous look around, he starts talking. He was turned only a few months ago, has lived in Portland since he was a young teenager, both on his own and drifting between rough sleeping groups and support homes. For all that, he's still idealistic, still fundamentally likes people, even if he doesn't trust them. If I had to guess, whoever embraced him was from some of our remaining philosopher kings, one of the Bruja who stayed in town thinking they could add Portland to the Anarch Free States. But Portland is commercializing its weird too fast, and we're still Camarilla for the time being. He's telling me about this old warehouse in industrial southeast where he's been staying since waking up craving blood when Lucille shows up. Lucille is old, powerful, and profoundly disinterested in everything around her except her art. This is her retirement plan, though she doesn't help me run it at all. Hasn't since our first 6 months. She doesn't dress like a farmer, choosing fine cashmere sweaters and woolen skirts, most of which I made for her. Tonight, she has her long blonde hair in 2 French braids and is at least wearing boots. She takes a seat near us without a word. Kasim cringes away reflexively. Well, I say, let's get started then. Whatever amount of comfort he'd gained from our easy little chat is gone. I told him to come ready to show off, but he doesn't know what that means, and he can tell Lucille is old. What exactly am I getting into, he asks. I like how direct he is. Exactly what it looks like, I say. Exactly what we say it is. We are an arts commune with a mission to prioritize the forgotten, the disadvantaged, and the downtrodden. And they're human. Yes. Except for you two. Except for us two. And you. He frowns, looks around as if he could see past the painted wooden walls, the pens, the bales of hay, and the farm equipment. And this is, what, a humanitarian mission? Lucille's lips quirk. She's likely thinking of the linguistic relationship between humanitarian and vegetarian. Yes, I watch the confusion, the disbelief deepen. And more. He turns that over in his head. But not hunting grounds. Not exactly. Another beat. Holy fuck, he says, finally, eyes widening. It's a farm! I grin. He's succeeding at showing off that he's got some amount of brain between his ears. It's a farm, I agree. Better than Eco-Village Death Camp, which I half expected him to call us. But no, he's not disgusted. He's riveted as I begin outlining the structure of our little enterprise, how the majority of our stock just provides blood donations, the ones Robin was so distressed by. The blood is taken in daytime by human phlebotomists, the majority of whom are in some way linked to the local Camarilla superstructure of the city. While they do take a portion of the donated blood to its ostensible official purpose, a certain amount is kept pure. No fractionation, no CPDA1, so it's a little chunky when it comes out of storage, like unhomogenized, unpasteurized milk, but it's safe. We keep that blood on site far from human housing, and I make deliveries weekly. We can only support so many customers like that, and even with the general distaste for bagged blood, demand still outstrips supply. Human bone marrow only pumps out new red cells so fast, no matter how much iron-rich food and nutritional yeast I put into the herd. For live feedings, our supply is even more limited, but we make a good enough product to charge a premium. We keep records on just about everything regarding our community members, I explain. Those records are obfuscated by a numbering system that matches our non-human livestock. We record share purchases of sheep and deliver human blood along with lamb rib roasts. Physical traits, personality traits, personal histories, current and past medical status, including drug habits, religious beliefs, orientation, the list goes on. It means we can match buyer with product. What do you do with the bodies? We try to minimize loss. After all, blood is a renewable resource.
I love this.
The unpasteurized milk bit. Like, oh, visceral detail, you.
There are a couple chapters specifically dealing with like the legality and registration requirements of slaughtering enterprises in Oregon that I got to like actually research statutes for. And it's one of those things where like these details to me are just interesting, and to most readers they are absolutely freaky. And I'm like, perfect. I can just. It's just a farming memoir.
That's all.
That's all.
So what were some challenges for this? You said that you didn't like how you did the lore dump, and
I wasn't
entirely
sure.
Why not?
So I, generally speaking, am not big on a lot of explicit lore in my own books. I kind of do the minimum necessary world building in order to tell usually very small scope stories. That I like to tell stories, with very small casts of characters. They're not changing the world. They're usually just going through the worst couple weeks of their lives. And so for this, though, I had to, once the reveal happened, I had to stitch it into how the world works. When I, even down to how I explained the unhomogenized blood, that language is specific to Vampire the Masquerade and how they talk about how blood bags do work. But I had to give enough details that anybody who knows the setting can immediately orient themselves to, okay, what is this social situation like? What is the political situation like in this town? There are also like little hints that I still managed to keep subtle. Like for those of you who play Vampire the Masquerade, Lee, our narrator, is a toreador. You wouldn't usually associate that with a farmer, but that was
Not
part of the
so much,
challenge.
no.
But so that I could still be kind of subtle about, because it's not as necessary to call out directly, but like, which is kind of inverse of what you'd expect, because like everyone knows about the clans and then the others, but like because people tend to know about them, it kind of fills in on its own. But like the current status of Portland was not established in any lore, so I had to create the political structure and then communicate it back out to the players. But then I also had to, for my own sake, try to do it in such a way that it wasn't distracting and annoying to people who don't care about the specifics. And it's tricky, it's always the balance of how much do you do that's how much do you involve a reader standing in character to receive the info dump. So Kasim is getting some of the info dump and he is providing some of the info dump by her interpretation of it. It's just a very dense, like, especially compared to the beginning this is 1/4 into the book when this happens. And prior to this, it's all been coy and just kind of hinted at, and then suddenly it's
a lot of inference.
It's terms. It's capitalized words. It's it's not quite to the point of here's the character sheet and here are the skills available to these characters, which did come up. I asked him, like, do I need to make this so my characters could be playable characters? Like, do they have to? And they're like, you can fudge it a little bit in terms of their build. They don't have to be exactly like if you can make them function, cool. But otherwise, story is more fun. Just don't do anything game breaking.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you. Marie, how about you?
I likewise chose a very lore dump heavy section because you said, it would be good to highlight, things where we had to make choices about how to interact with the canon and so forth.
Yeah.
And likewise, I feel that this is not the most spectacular part of the book. It is a little bit clunky because there's a bunch of exposition for me to go through. In this case, this is... There's a village in the rural mountains of the Dragon Clan's lands that have been suffering recent attacks by supernatural creatures. And so a samurai named Ryotora has been sent up there to find out what's going on. And he gets to the village and finds out there is a visitor from the Phoenix clan there who shouldn't be there, a guy named Asako Seken. So at this point, Ryotora has just questioned Ogano, who's the headman of the village, about what exactly has been going on. And so this is basically a couple of pages of Ryotora thinking through what could be happening. The creatures Ogano described sounded like yokai, but that didn't get him very far. Saying, this was caused by supernatural creatures was like telling a patient, your symptoms are caused by a disease. Which creatures and why? What baffled him was the sheer array. Ryotora couldn't identify everything Ogano had described. Ogano hadn't given enough detail to identify many of them anyway. But it made no sense for so many different creatures to show up in the same place at the same time. A traveler might encounter a Nureonna on the bank of a river, or a faceless Noperabo along a deserted road, or an Akaname in a filthy bathing chamber. He didn't encounter all three of them, and dozens more besides, in a mountain village that had never done anything to attract such supernatural attention. It sounded like an eruption of influence from Senkyo, the enchanted realms that existed alongside the mortal world. Most likely creatures of Sakaku, that group of yokai liked to play tricks on people, and sometimes the tricks became lethal. But he couldn't discount the possibility of Yumedo either. Ordinarily, people only touched the realm of dreams in their sleep, but if it somehow bled through into waking life, the villagers' fears could have manifested as terrible monsters. Perhaps. If the villagers knew tales of all these yokai, though given how obscure some of them were, he doubted that. Or perhaps they had offended a kami. But which one? If the mines had somehow disturbed the kami of the mountain, Ryotora would have expected different consequences. A cave-in, maybe, or crops failing. The earth kami weren't known for indulging in capricious trickery. But he wouldn't expect any air kami around here to be powerful enough to cause something like this. Regardless, at least he had avenues of inquiry to follow. He could ask whether anything unusual had happened in the days leading up to the first incident, and question the villagers for more specifics on the yokai, to see if he could discern any kind of pattern in them. He'd also promised Ogano that he would place wards, probably not necessary yet, as the attacks had so far happened only on the 3 nights of the full moon, but he didn't want to take any chances. Because Seibomura was valuable to the Dragon Clan. The cinnabar mined here was used to make vermilion pigment, useful particularly in crafting beautiful red lacquerware, which the dragon traded all across the empire. And the alchemists among the Agasha had many uses for the quicksilver they extracted from that ore. The clan's policy for the last generation or more had been to consolidate its declining villages, relocating peasants from remote areas into more central and productive lands. Ordinarily, a place as isolated as Seibomura would have been high on the list for consolidation. But before Ryotora left Heibesu, the governor had said he was thinking of moving peasants into the village to increase cinnabar production and make up for the declining population there. Ryotora would not find a welcome waiting for him in Heibesu if he instead evacuated Seibomura, but if he couldn't solve this issue before the full moon, then for the sake of the people here, he would have to do exactly that. And hope the problems didn't follow them south. Closing up his writing kit and tucking the scribbled sheaf of paper into his kimono, Ryotora prepared to head back down to the village. As he rose, though, he caught sight of Asako Seken standing outside Ogano's house. The phoenix was looking toward a cluster of women washing laundry in a large tub. The wind was from the wrong direction for Ryotaro to hear anything, but he'd been in enough isolated villages to know what Sekken must be hearing. Followers of the Perfect Land sect often chanted the kie to provide a rhythm while they worked. Over breakfast this morning, Ryotaro had ascribed Sekken's suspicion merely to the usual phoenix prejudice. Now, watching him watch the peasants, a worse possibility occurred to Ryotaro. What if he's an inquisitor? Ryotaro's sensei had run afoul of an inquisitor once, which was the only reason he even knew the name. Many clans had groups dedicated to stamping out heresies, but the most secretive of them all were the Phoenix Inquisitors. Their target was not merely simple heresies like the Perfect Land, or the cults of Lord Moon, but truly blasphemous practices, like the blood magic known as Maho. Ryotaro had been thinking of the disturbances in Seibomura as some kind of spiritual accident. He'd never considered that someone might have done this on purpose. He felt as if someone had placed a dagger of ice against his heart. Ryotaro knew very little about Maho. He didn't want to know more. Its use tainted the Maho-tsukai with the corruption of Jigoku, and the stories whispered that even familiarity with its principles tempted one to reach for that power. But he did know that Jigoku's taint, once embedded in a person or place, could spread. Down in the lands of the Crab Clan, where they fought a constant war against creatures from Jigoku far worse than simple yokai, sometimes that meant slaughtering whole villages and burning them to the ground to root out the taint. If such a thing took hold here... Ryotaro jerked his shoulders, trying to dislodge his unease. It was a theory, nothing more. One that wouldn't have even crossed his mind if Asako Sekken hadn't been in Seibomura. If someone had caused this, it didn't necessarily follow that they had done so by means of Maho. And even if blood magic were at work in the village, he was leaping well ahead to assume that stopping it would mean destroying everyone and everything here. A clench and release of his hands helped steady his thoughts. One thing at a time. The bodies of the dead had been cremated. A precaution Ryotaro remembered that an emperor had instituted centuries ago to prevent Maho-tsukai raising corpses from their graves. But he needed to make sure their spirits had moved on, lest they too began to haunt Seibomura. Then he needed to create wards, then question people and find answers. And pray to the kami and the fortunes that any spirit realms influencing this place had no connection to Jigoku.
Nice.
So, with that, I actually find Maho and all the stuff with Jigoku and the Shadowlands incredibly uninteresting. But it was something where I'm like, okay, there's spiritual crap going on here, people are being attacked. It would occur to my character. I have to put in the fear about that, and what if Sekken's an Inquisitor, and all of that, because the reader's going to think of it, Ryotaro should think of it, so it's got to go in there. Spoiler, it's not Maho, because I find it boring. And, there's a bunch of different spirit realms that, he's got to think through the possibilities for those. But then there's also places where, I was kind of... The way that I usually describe these books to people is I say they're supposed to be approachable to people who don't know L5R at all. If you find historical Japan interesting, these should appeal to you. But they're going to feel like they take place in a slightly larger world than the story itself strictly calls for, because there's references to things like the Crab Clan, who are literally at the other end of the empire, and they don't show up in the story, except that, they'll be thought of at certain points in time. And so you get these references that aren't, they don't seem necessary for, what Caitlin was saying about doing limited world building, only what is needed for that story. This goes well beyond that. And there's also places where, with things like... the Dragon Clan is having a problem of its birth rate dropping. And so I'm the one who made up things like, okay, they've got a policy of consolidating their villages, and I'm going to make that up so that I can then play with that around what's going on in this village and such. Or things like the that heretical sect, the Perfect Land, and how it's deeply embedded in Dragon lands. And so this was an opportunity to show, okay, what does that mean? So there were canon things that I was able to make very direct use of in my story, but also then canon things that I was, going, okay, well, we've got to acknowledge it.
Well, I liked the fact that you made it very accessible to me as somebody who has not played Legend of the Five Rings, and I'm not immersed in Japanese lore in any substantial way, but you were definitely giving me enough synonyms that I was floating along with it, as opposed to being drowning and overwhelmed. So I really appreciated that in the way that you presented it.
That's a thing I've put a lot of thought into, because, and probably some of your listeners do, I am now in year 8 of a Patreon about world building. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about is when you have all this world building, how, on the level of the language on the page, do you get that across as gracefully as possible
Yep.
without going, let
Yep.
me
Yep.
stop and explain? And yeah,
Yep.
synonyms are actually one of the key things. Like, introduce a term and then stick in a positive after it that, expands on
Oh,
it in an
yes.
informative way.
Oh, yeah. All right. Kate, how about you?
All right, I've enjoyed listening to these immensely. That was great. I'm going to read from the opening chapter of my second book in the series. So the first book, The Magus Conspiracy, follows the stories of a former British soldier named Simeon and a French equestrian acrobat named Pierrette. 7 years after their adventures in the first novel complete, the next novel, The Resurrection Plot, begins in Cairo in 1868. And so I'll just read the opening pages. Pierrette Arnaud sat on the edge of a 4-story roof and pulled her cloak tightly around her, so the blue ball gown beneath wouldn't draw attention. Beside her, Sophia El-Nadi was dressed in her usual dark shawl that fell in a peak over the forehead, a thin gold cylinder between her eyes holding the black crocheted veil that hit at her waist. Much less conspicuous, at least in this part of Cairo. The women were 2 small additions to a skyscape of square roofs and twisting domes, lattice windows and fluted columns, stonework and plaster. Their feet dangled from the roof of a gable, a good vantage point. Sophia had kept company with Pierrette on the walk from the house they shared near one of the old city gates. From the beginning, Pierrette felt they were being followed. She trusted her instincts, but if there was someone following, she couldn't see them. Perhaps she had reached the moment in her life as an assassin when ghosts would dog her steps. It would only be fair. She had created enough of them. Nonetheless, she had signaled to Sophia to change course, so they'd come to the street where Sophia's husband, Gamal Sabri, was selling books today. It was a street they knew well, and they'd both climbed lightly up onto the roofs in a narrow alley. In the coffee shop opposite their rooftop, a half-dozen men smoked long pipes under an awning and chatted with Gamal, who had spread the books from his cart onto a carpeted table. Gamal liked to say that bookselling was merely an excellent way for an assassin to monitor the streets of Cairo, but he couldn't hide his passion for the job. Gamal caught the women's eyes, his turban tilting slightly as he looked up. The street was busy, with water carriers and vendors calling out, and women passing through on donkeys, servants at their side. Gamal took an English copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species off his table to show it to a customer. Pierrette recognized it from the golden triangles on the green spine. She'd perused the books on Gamal's cart many times. I see no followers, Sophia said. The shadows were long. The sun was beginning to set. She had to be at the opera house soon. Still, something kept her where she was. Do you want to go over the plan again? Sophia asked patiently. You seem nervous. Pierrette was 37 years old, a skilled assassin, and a veteran circus performer. She did not think of herself as a person who got nervous. The reason she'd come to Egypt in the first place was that she'd been frustrated by the unwillingness of the British assassins to take risks. She was here to fight. She was grateful to have a task she believed in. Nonetheless, she couldn't deny her unease. Sophia seemed to sense it too. She had spoken in French, though she usually spoke in Arabic to help Pierrette practice. I suppose I am. It's been a long time since I've been in fine company, Pierrette said, tucking a silk bow beneath her cloak. Truth be told, she was looking forward to the chance to wear a beautiful new dress. And I've never met the Khedive. She was looking forward to that, too. Khedive Ismail Pasha, Viceroy of Egypt, technically answered to the Ottoman Sultan, but he had ambitions of his own. Not only was he intent on rebuilding half of Cairo, but he had covered Egypt in railway lines and presided over the 10-year construction of the Suez Canal. Tonight, weeks of celebrations would begin as the canal was nearly ready to open. The Khedive would entertain his guests, including heads of state, at a reception and opera, and Pierrette would be among them. He will be dazzled by you, Sophia said staunchly. Who wouldn't be? Besides, he wants your expertise for the new circus and hippodrome. That's just the line we used to get my invitation. The Khedive has too many people to advise him on entertainments. I wouldn't be so sure. He had to send away his Armenian impresario in the spring, don't forget. I haven't forgotten. And I still don't think that story makes sense. Why did the man leave Cairo freely with money in his pocket if he tried to plant a bomb in the Khedive's theater box? It doesn't add up. There's too much happening in this city that we don't understand. It was not for lack of trying, she knew. Cairo's assassins kept careful watch on their ancient enemies, the Templars. There was always a strong Templar presence in the city, since that order was obsessed with finding artifacts, so it had a spy on every archaeological dig site. After the bomb was found in the theater, the assassins' minds had gone right away to the Templar-orchestrated assassination of Abraham Lincoln, 4 years ago. But there was no evidence connecting the Templars to the attempt on the Khedive's life. All monarchs had to deal with such threats, after all. The Khedive has guards to protect him. Your job tonight is to face a much more terrible danger, Sophia said. She leaned towards Pierrette and said with mock horror, "An American businessman." That got a smile from Pierrette. She wiped her hands and prepared to leave their perch, when a flash of purple and gold caught her eye. On the table across the street, Gamal had placed a book upright, so that its gorgeous embossed cover faced them. The Bulak Press edition of the Book of Gnosis by Ibrahim Haki Erzurumi. It was a striking and unusual edition, which was why it was their agreed symbol. It meant danger. I'll stop there.
Ooh. That's a great intro to the world. I loved the world setting. I had a vivid image of Cairo. I could basically see it as if I were hovering above it in game. And you tied all the little plot lines of, oh, there's a Templar assassination of Abraham Lincoln over here, and there's this over here. You're tying all these elements together. It was beautifully done. What did you want to say about this? What did you have to struggle with, or what was easy about this, or what?
Yeah. So it was attempting to do all of those things, and it's a lot of pressure to put on an opening chapter for sure. Like Marie, I wanted to have these books be accessible to anyone who had never played Assassin's Creed, who didn't know what it was or anything like that. So if you're just interested in historical settings with something a little bit weird going on. And I also was hoping that book 2 would also be accessible to someone who hadn't picked up book 1, because I always like to make that at least possible. It would be better if you read book 1 first, but at least possible to pick up book 2. So I wanted to do the sort of catch up from book 1, and also here's what Assassin's Creed is all about, and also we're in Cairo, the Suez Canal is being built, and here's our main character, and
I think
all
you
of
did
those
it deftly.
things.
I think you did it absolutely deftly.
Okay, thanks. And the other, and I also just wanted to have that sense of fun of we're up on the rooftops in Cairo, and like that's a kind of Assassin's Creed-y kind of feeling. Is like you could imagine this as a game. But the other challenge, the sort of less obvious challenge, I think, for me in this, is that I had to do a lot of sort of background inventing of what was going to be happening in the Assassin's Creed world to understand just little bits and pieces that you might not even see. So, for example, I had nobody telling me how many assassins are in Cairo at this time. What does the Bureau of Assassins look like in Cairo at this time? Who's in charge? How do they fit in with the other assassins in the world at this time? All of that, because nobody's bothered to write it because there's no game there. So I had a little bit of leeway to do that, which is scary because then you're like, am I gonna do something wrong, or is somebody? So yeah, that was the challenge for me.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. All three of you. Those were wonderful readings, and I thought each one of you did. I think you all knocked it out of the park, obviously. We're going to just shift gears here a little bit. We're going to talk about, do you have any more media tie-ins coming up soon, or is it all your own IP that's coming out for you at the moment? So here's your chance to do some promo of what you are doing in the near future or in the recent past. Caitlin.
No more IP work at the moment. I instead have an extremely busy 2025 coming up. At the beginning of 2025, I have a sapphic arranged marriage romance novella coming out from Neon Hemlock, which we mentioned earlier.
Okay.
It's my first time writing or publishing a not horror novel, not horror property. It's kind of like science fantasy, kind of like a Final Fantasy city sort of setting. And that's called The Oblivion Bride. It's part of the Neon Hemlock Kickstarter that not sure when this is going to go out, but was running throughout the month of March.
Okay.
And then in May or June, we're still figuring out exact timing. I've got a high fantasy horror novel coming out from Harper Voyager called The Starving Saints, which we pitched as American Horror Story in Westeros. There is lots of cannibalism. There is lots of power exchange, kink stuff going on. It's a very weird book. There are fairies. And then towards the end of 2025, I've got Graceview, which is what I'm calling Hospital Gothic, about just how crazy you can go during an inpatient stay.
Interesting. Okay. Marie, what's coming out soon or out recently for you?
Out recently, well, due to just weird coincidences of scheduling and such, I actually had 4 novels out in the last 12 months, which was absurd. 2 of them were these L5R novels, so that trilogy is now complete. The Night Parade of 100 Demons was the first book, which, if you know your Japanese folklore, yes, it is the Hyaki Yagyo. And then The Game of 100 Candles, and it is concluded with The Market of 100 Fortunes. I also concluded the Rook and Rose trilogy that I was writing with Alyss, and had a standalone Norse revenge epic called The Waking of Angantyr. For what's coming out soon, I can't tell you, because with the IP stuff, it's the NDA of, theoretically, eventually, that thing that I wrote for will be out in the world. Don't know when.
Well, I look forward to you coming back on the podcast to tell me about it when you're allowed to talk about it.
Yeah. I will say it's a novelette in something rather than it being like a whole novel.
Okay.
And then there's other things that I can't talk about yet, so secrets.
Ooh. Kate, how about you? Out soon or coming out in the recent past?
Yeah, my most recent novel that's out now is the Valkyrie. Marie and I both had Norse reimaginings out at the same time. And my next one of my own work is called The Tapestry of Time, and it is 4 clairvoyant sisters punching Nazis in World War II in Paris and London. So that one is, it's coming out in September from Harper Voyager UK. And should be out in North America around the same time. In terms of IP stuff, nothing really coming out. I am working on something that I can't talk about, which is a kind of a shared world thing, but it's in the not talking about phase at the moment.
Yeah.
So other than that, it's just The Tapestry of Time is my next thing.
All right. Thank you all for having been here to talk with me on this topic. I really enjoyed the conversation. All of you were great conversationalists. Next week on Shining Moon will be, and you can tell I will hopefully be recovered by then. Next week on Shining Moon, we'll be shifting gears to talk about writing real-world religions in fiction with Priya Chand, Robin Duncan, and Zohar Jacobs. Thank you all for having been here. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if you want to, and we are out.